Thank you and good morning everybody for joining our webinar. We'll be running a 40-minute session on mandatory training transformation studies. They're based on a series of consulting engagements that myself, Matt Plass and Gabriel Sasko have been leading in the past 3 months. Matt, I think I'm actually just getting a bit of feedback, so you might want to just pop yourself on mute until you speak.
Sure.
Oh, that's much better. So the purpose of today was to share the work that we have been doing, and in essence, the reason that we're presenting it now is we're seeing an increased interest in assessing the effectiveness of compliance training. Firms are stepping back and seeing what they can do to improve the culture, the value of their learning, and move to more consistent messaging. And I think the reason that we've been brought in as an external partner to help with those studies is we provide a holistic view, and we're able to sit from the sidelines based upon what we have seen with other firms. I think it's part of a broader drive overall to improve the reputation of compliance training. We want to move our function away from being somebody who polices the business to a positive force within shaping the culture of an organization. In terms of the panel today, we have Matt Plass, who is the Chief Learning Officer with Interactive Services, and Gabriel Sasko, Director of Performance Solutions. They will be great speakers as they have been working on site. I think it's actually been with 5 clients now in the past 90 days looking at the compliance programs. And what we'll be doing today is presenting an analysis framework that we use internally with our clients that helps deliver over a 5-week period better training, better communication, and better governance. We'll be taking questions throughout, so if you wanted to ping them using the messaging forum, Neil Cullen, our colleague based in Dublin, Ireland, will take the questions and then we'll present them at the end. As I said before, all slides that we present today will be available for download, and we should aim to get through the session in about 40 minutes. So with that in mind, maybe Neil, you could move us on to the agenda. So for the next 40 minutes, I'll be interviewing Matt and Gabriel. We're hoping that it'll be a dialogue, and we're going to answer 5 questions. What is a mandatory transformation study? Which organizations will benefit? What happens during that study? We'll talk in detail about the transformation process that we follow and why we think it's the right way to approach mandatory training and compliance. We'll talk about what we can get done in 5 weeks in terms of actionable outcomes. And then finally, we'll share some of the deliverables that have come from real-life studies that we've done with big multinational clients in the past 3 months. Before we do that, I know about 40% of the people that were joining the webinar today are new to our organization, so welcome, and we're delighted to have you attend this session. Our firm Interactive Services has been in business for the past 24 years, and historically we have developed learning programs for international businesses in areas such as corporate compliance, new hire orientation, and supporting global product launches. In the past year, we've seen that expertise move from being purely a content provider, especially in the compliance space, to coming in as a consultant and working with our clients to help plan their mandatory training programs. And that goes far beyond just looking at the content that's used, but also looking around communication awareness and the governance structure that is associated with compliance training. In terms of our core offering in the compliance space, it's ICT. ICT is a library of over 80 ready-made 5-minute topics. They're available in 12 languages. The e-learning is being built for you to add your own screens alongside our stock content for areas such as data privacy, information security, anti-harassment, anti-bribery, antitrust, anti-money laundering. We update the program each year. It's designed to sit on your LMS, but we can also provide hosting for you, and all the content that we offer is mobile ready. And the final piece is we offer an unlimited enterprise license, which is particularly useful for any firms that are going through rapid growth and have a head count. So that gets the introductions out the way, and from here on in, we're really going to focus on hearing from Matt and Gabriel, who have been responsible for running these studies. The first question, if it's okay, I'd like to present to Matt, our Chief Learning Officer. In a nutshell, Matt, could you summarize what is a transformation study?
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, it's essentially a consulting engagement, and it's something that we've seen become increasingly popular in the last few months. There are various reasons for that, and I think we're going to cover some of those as we move through the session today. But essentially, it's looking at, in a holistic fashion, the entire compliance mandatory training and communication piece, and asking, where are you now and where would you like to be in 12 months' time? And then coming up with a structure and a framework and a plan for getting from the current state into the future desired state. So it's a roadmap, is one very good way of putting it. And in terms of when you try and break this down into the components, it's really about trying to define a vision for what your compliance training and communication should look like, identifying some of the barriers that are going to get in the way of achieving that state, and then starting to identify some of the things, the actions that can be taken to remove those barriers, and finally asking how as an organization you're going to work together differently so that you can govern and achieve the aspirations that you've identified.
And when you say mandatory training, does that refer to a specific part of compliance, or is it looking across the entire curriculum?
Well, it can be both. I mean, I think compliance programs have grown organically in most organizations, and what tends to happen is they become fairly siloed. So you have the regulatory requirement, which is the absolute immovable object of the compliance communication training that has to take place within every company for them to remain legal. Then you have the pieces that are mandated by the company itself, but not necessarily by the regulator. Then you have other elements which perhaps might be a little more optional. Typically, most organizations will take a look at their compliance communication and training piece and realize actually it's very fragmented. Different people own different pieces. You might have one group that owns the anti-money laundering, another group owns the information security compliance training, another group owns maybe the real basics like the slips, trips and falls, and then obviously anti-harassment, and there's another huge piece that could be owned by the HR function within an organization. And we've found that some of the largest organizations in the world just do not have that holistic view of what's going on, or at least they don't have the ability to pull it all together and make governance decisions that can streamline the way they do communication and compliance. And that's just the logistics. I mean, it also includes the way that compliance is messaged and the value the organization sees in the whole compliance piece as well. So what we're talking about today is really just the start of the journey. It's the initial short consulting piece that gives you a kickstart into starting to think about how you can improve the way you do compliance in your organization by looking at what you currently have, looking at where you'd like to be, and giving you a very reasonable and doable roadmap for getting between the two.
Thank you so much, Matt. Gabriel, we'll bring you in at this stage. You really have been the boots on the ground, leading some of these engagements, working on site with our clients. Could you talk to us, Gabriel, about what are the trigger points when a client would benefit from a study like this? And maybe, Neil, you might want to just move the slides on here.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark, and thank you. I mean, obviously we have these, 5 sort of triggers here on the screen, and to Matt's point earlier, you can say that this sort of transformation process or that roadmap and defining it can be easy, but you do have all of these different content owners and moving parts that protect, their risk areas, may act as guardians of their content. There are a myriad of regulatory and legal requirements across different states, countries, and municipalities that have to be taken into account through this process. And to be honest, it can be difficult for the L&D function to really have the time and resources to coordinate, these development events and support reactions to events in the marketplace or changes in what is a priority from a risk mitigation standpoint. So, all that being said, what we found is that out of these engagements, we find ways to increase engagement with the learner. So again, we're moving from training as an activity to a cultural event. We're making sure we can reduce seat time and define a cohesive strategy. So make sure that efficacy and the efficiency of that training really tunes the learner in and that end user, and that it's targeted to somebody that is in sales has a very different need than somebody that is in investment or distribution and those sorts of things. So making sure that we reduce not only the time for learners and target that training better, but also if there's a need to reduce time demands for the subject matter experts or the L&D function, this is a real opportunity to find out better ways to do that and really come to the table with a cohesive compliance and mandatory training development strategy.
Fantastic. And any thoughts around the global piece and creating a brand before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly, one of the challenges that we found, and when organizations may seek out this type of analysis and study is, when you have sort of a global core that you know is going to exist, throughout the organization. Again, you may want to target that to specific audiences or tailor that experience, but then also you have, regional needs and or localization components that are required, and making sure that there's a way of creating that in a flexible rapid development process, so that wherever those regional needs exist, the organization is agile and flexible enough to develop that content as a supplemental activity that stays on brand and on message is certainly something that we see as a need, and something that comes out of these studies that we do. So we support that effort to make sure that regionalization of content is easy, is consistent, and on brand with whatever the coordinated and cohesive strategy becomes.
Is it typically firms with essentially a broken compliance program, or is it more firms that are looking to improve on what they're doing? What sort of state have the organizations been in when you've been approached to come in and actually meet with these organizations on site?
Yeah, we rarely find that it's what I would describe as a broken strategy or not meeting the basic content needs of the organization. It's really about a response to regulators and other entities asking, okay, you're doing the training, what else? How are you creating multiple channels to reach your audiences, target content, but also outside of the training? How are you reaching them? How are you reinforcing these messages? And then also, I'd say the second component of this is it's not broken, but it is seen as inefficient, and it is seen as noise, that the signal-to-noise ratio could be better in the organization. So what we're finding is we're being asked to, put our arms around how can we improve that signal-to-noise ratio, how can we make it more efficient and timely, and how can we make sure that it actually sticks and has efficacy and the behavioral outcomes they're looking for in the organization.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Neil, maybe you could move us on to the next question. Matt, I think Gabriel has done a good job there of outlining the reasons why a firm would reassess its compliance strategy, step back and take that holistic view. Could you talk about the meat of an engagement and what makes up a mandatory training transformation study?
Yes. So I think one of the first questions people ask is how long does it take and how much does it cost? So let's get that out of the way straight away. I think I mentioned earlier it's 5 weeks end to end. It's really 4 weeks of sort of intensive work and then a week of reviews spread throughout that. And the investment varies between around $15,000 to something just under $30,000. It is a consultancy engagement essentially, and each time we do it, it's slightly different, but it does always follow the same kind of key milestones. So the first thing is around the goal setting, and that business alignment from the key stakeholders is absolutely vital, because everything else we do is going to play off an initial shared sense of what we would like compliance to be within that organization. Now, it might be around exceeding the regulatory requirements, and many firms do set the bar very high. They actually like to go above and beyond the regulatory requirements that are set. It could be around the learning. I mean, often, the bread and butter of our business is learning, and for many of these organizations, when they get into the real work of implementing this plan, 60–70% of that is about improving the learning, maybe reducing the learning, cutting it down. But it's also about the cultural impact. And when you start looking at all those things together, you start to see where you might save some money or maybe even make some money by making compliance, that competitive advantage. So goal setting is the first stage. Second stage is something that we can do just by looking at the data points that are there. So we look at the current program, we look at some of the completion metrics, any other metrics that you have that we might be able to use as a lever to try and decide how we're going to improve the process. Then it's about getting into some of the soft areas, talking to the SMEs, talking to some of the learners, running compliance focus groups, learner focus groups, and trying to understand what's working and what isn't working. So the data will only give us so much. We really need to be speaking to the people also, and that means we need to revise some of the goals, but at this stage, it does mean we can start to map out our action plan. And in terms of the outcomes, the actual deliverables, what do you get? Well, essentially, you get a plan for the 3 things that are written along the bottom here. So your plan will tell you how we think you can achieve better training, better communication, and better governance. Now, that might include some of the things that we've listed on the right of this slide. It might be that one of the things we need to look at is a compliance learning brand. So we think about how compliance is viewed within the organization, what we can do to elevate compliance within the organization, make the messaging consistent, make people hear that they feel that they're hearing from a single voice. It could be about looking at the learner journeys for each individual audience and trying to consolidate some of those journeys down so people take less training or more targeted training. It might be looking at your global versus your regional strategy and understanding whether you need to have a break there. It might be looking at the pieces that are often neglected, which are the communication and awareness elements outside of the core training. A big part of it is almost always governance. So we can make recommendations and support you in setting up advisory groups and internal governance groups to make sure that the ideas you have during this analysis don't die on the vine and they actually take root and become something that's vital in the organization. And then, of course, there's a technical piece. So one of the tenets of compliance training is that it needs to be tracked. We need to know who's done it. We need to know how well they did. And we need to be able to prove this at any given time to a regulator or in a court. So there's the LMS piece. There's the sort of technical recording aspect of the role. And then finally, the annual transformation planning, which is really about looking at how do we make this transformation over the first year, and then following that first year, what do the subsequent years look like? How do we start to calendarize the compliance experience and move away from the occasional big hit into more of a frequent drip of information and awareness that really does start to impact the culture.
Before we move on, Gabriel, just would love to get some feedback from actually running these studies and being the team leader in the room. Do you usually see a common set of goals when you meet with the stakeholders in terms of what the business is trying to do, or is L&D and the compliance team heading in quite different directions in your practical experience?
So what I have generally found is, and if they even found it in the room this morning, was we find that compliance and learning and development are generally well aligned, and where you have a tension point is with the content or risk area owners, so the people that are ultimately responsible for, if it's data privacy, if it's financial crimes or anti-money laundering, those content and risk owners are really holding onto that content and acting as guardians. So one of the goals that we generally find is that we need to get on the same page. So how do we define an operationalized goal for this mandatory training development and communications development, and how do we share that between these risk area owners and compliance/L&D? So I think that's one big outcome, and out of that comes how do we target specific roles? So what are those learner journeys by role? How do we calendar the events, and what is the governance process for calendaring events and communication so that signal to noise ratio I mentioned earlier improves? So I think those are kind of I don't find that compliance and L&D so much are misaligned as I do that compliance L&D are in one camp of trying to get their arms around this, and risk owners wanting or having different goals, and marrying those together, making sure that the learning's engaging, it's hitting the right people at the right time, and that it feels part of a cohesive strategy. I think those are kind of the three main buckets in terms of goals.
Excellent. Well, Gabriel, we're going to keep with your practical advice for the next section, if you could move us on here, Neil. Could you walk us through a case study? I mean, obviously we can't go into specifics of who the firm was, but could you just talk about the transformation process and frame it within the context of a real study that we completed in the past 3 months?
Yeah, absolutely. So the case study I'll speak to is for a global financial firm. They have over 30,000 employees. Again, those employees sit in different regions of the world with different regional needs and risks opportunities. And we're basically right now in the process of helping them get one of those advisory boards set up for governing those development decisions. And again, when we talk about development, we're not just talking about training, we're talking about that communication strategy and messaging. So for some organizations, that brand, that compliance brand, if you will, may be all about sort of entertainment and engaging through creative ways. For others, it may be very professionalized. So that's one of the things we're working on with them. We're also working with them to develop a communication toolkit so that for those risk owners, it's very easy, the lift for them, for those SMEs and those content owners, it's very easy for them to say, I think this email about phishing attempts, we find a spike in those in August each year after people come back from summer vacation. They're a little less alert. We're developing a toolkit for them to say, okay, we need a phishing email to go out. Here's a template, so that content owner can submit that into this advisory group. They say, yes, that's calendared for August. We're going to follow up with this short animation or this piece on the intranet, and it's going to be part of a cohesive strategy for what we do across the year. So we're helping them set up that advisory board and that communication toolkit. And then finally, we're implementing profilers and test down options to make sure that their compliance mandatory training is more targeted and more efficient. So one of the goals there was to reduce seat time, not for the sake of reducing seat time, but to make sure that people who need to be tuned into certain risk areas are tuned into it, and that the communications and training strategy is focused on them just in time and just in place, when they need to know it. So, again, to get there, Matt spoke to this earlier, we conducted a gap analysis of their current content and their approach against their goals. We completed on-site interviews and focus groups, and what I'd say there is we find that there are three umbrellas that we really need to talk to. There's the compliance and L&D, there's the end learner across different roles and functions, and then there are those content and risk owners, and above them any sponsors or champions of that. So those are kind of who we get into the room and make sure we talk to in that process. And then finally, analyze that content against the audiences, those roles, to create the learner journeys that are going to be effective and build the calendar against that. So that's, in a nutshell, what we've done for that organization.
Sounds easy when you summarize it like that.
Right.
Neil, if you could move us on here, Matt, we'll pose this one to you. Could you talk us about the main activities that happen over that 5-week period?
Yes, I will. So if we try and break that 5 weeks down, and we start to look at where the review periods fit in, what the actual activity is, the first couple of weeks are really around looking at what exists already. So it's looking at the existing training programs, communications, starting to understand the data points that are made available to us, and usually we can do that off-site. So if we would do a data gathering exercise with our client, we'd ask them perhaps to give us access to the existing training. There are some data points that we wouldn't have access to, but we can ask for a summary of, and they might need to speak to HR to get hold of some of that information. But the first couple of weeks are really spent looking at the current landscape and making an assessment of where we think that is, benchmarked against other organizations that we've worked with, and also just some general sense of best practice that we have through our own research. Week 3 is when we try to get on site. Now, on site is not necessarily literal. It might mean webinars or phone calls, but it's really about trying to get some human contact, face-to-face, running focus groups, understanding from the key stakeholders, not only the sponsors and the owners, but also the developers, the content owners, and the learners themselves about what's important and where the organization is trying to go in terms of compliance. And that allows us to put together the report. So week 4 is really about us preparing that final analysis report. And as we mentioned before, the report varies depending on the client, but it always contains certain elements. It always has it always contains an element of our articulation of the current landscape and the opportunity, our articulation of the vision, which we've heard from the stakeholders as we've been working through the piece, some kind of roadmap or plan for implementation of that desired state, and also recommendations, very specific recommendations about specific areas of the content that we feel could be improved, consolidated, removed, to just help engage with that streamline. And the other thing I'd say is, although this is a fairly short engagement, I mean, you go from where you are now to where you'd like to be in just 5 weeks, we're also very aware that when you roll something like this out, you can't boil the ocean. You have to do it in stages, but also the business needs to see quick wins. So we pay a lot of attention to what year 1 is going to look like. And we make sure that we've thought about, what are we going to be able to show the business that we have done within the first quarter that will give everyone a sense that we're on the right track, and that the initiative is worth getting behind, and that the solution we've come up with is right. And that would carry us all the way through to the end of the year, by which hopefully all of the new way of working would have been rolled out and the organization would see a tangible benefit. But just pulling back to the 5-week timeline, yeah, by week 7, all the reviews have been completed, and you have that final report, which would include some kind of executive presentation that you'd be able to tour the information around the organization.
The one thing I would add there, Matt, is that I think it's an important call out, is that not all of our recommendations are ones that we would expect to carry out. We may be well positioned to do some of the work, but there are also recommendations that we expect would be carried out in the organization. So that's certainly something I wanted to make sure as part of that solution design was evident.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So there's two sides to that. I mean, that some of the recommendations we make are absolutely things that we feel we're very well positioned to design and build ourselves or to support. But others are purely internal. I mean, often the governance structure, you may ask us to help in setting it up, but once it's set up, it's usually a lot of room that we don't have access to, and that's absolutely as we'd expect. So the governance piece tends to be internal. But also there's other external pieces. So other partners will be brought in on our recommendation, not necessarily people we know, but certainly we wouldn't suggest that we're able to deliver on everything that we recommend. But we can certainly put you in touch with the people who would fill in the gaps.
I'm going to keep us on schedule, gents, and for the final 5 minutes, it'd be great if we could take a little of time just to look at some deliverables together. I think one of the most interesting ones was a learning journey, either for new hires or existing employees. Gabriel's going to take the lead on what is often one of the most interesting pieces of work that we bring back.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an extract of a new hire learning journey within a financial services firm. And it's based on that new employee entering the company, and while I don't want to read each event along this timeline, it does reflect that there's a blend of formal e-learning, informal communications, and live one-to-one events. And another important note is that it spreads that learning and those development efforts and activities over a period of time. We want to improve retention and the efficacy of those efforts, and we want to make sure it sticks in terms of what's relevant to what they might be doing as they progress and grow in their role. So this is over a 2-month period, rather than front-loading, some of this mandatory development effort. We spread that out and make sure that the timeliness is there. So we absolutely know that code of conduct has to be up front, and if there's industry compliance requirements, those have to be up front. But where we have an opportunity to spread that out and make sure that we can bring in other types of events and imbue a culture and reflect that culture in their onboarding experience and connect them to their manager or the compliance team in meaningful ways, that's something that's reflected here. And the other thing I noticed is that this training journey would look very different for somebody who's been with the company for multiple years. So their annual calendar wouldn't be as front-loaded. The seat time wouldn't be as much. So again, this is a very specific snapshot. And there's another slide for day 60 onwards for a new hire that is beyond this one. But it definitely reflects that we're going to treat a new hire and that onboarding of mandatory training as a longitudinal process, a progression, and it is going to look different for somebody who's been in role, either in a different seat in the operations, in a different role, or has been there a long period of time.
That's great. I really appreciate that, and it's quite a tactical overview of a deliverable with a lot of detail. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit higher level now about the broader piece of raising communication and awareness, which sits alongside training?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is really an application of some of the ideas we've been talking about. So I mentioned earlier that we like to think in terms of a 12-month communication and awareness plan. If you are trying to elevate compliance within the organization and you want people to feel that they're hearing from one source of truth, then it's not enough to train people once a year. So we start to think about, well, what else can we do across the year, and how can we calendarize the content that we have so that it's coming out regularly, and it's coming out with a single brand, and it's coming out as if it's from a single voice. And it stops being something that people at best are disinterested by and at worst resent, and it actually becomes something people look forward to seeing. So this is an example, and this is how you might plan across the campaign. We are recommending email template kits so that every single message that people receive from compliance looks and feels as if it's coming from the same place. There is always that primary learning piece. That's the second bubble that we see there, which is the core content. Now that could be taken in one setting or spread across the year. Regardless of that, though, what else can we do? Well, we can actually start placing banner ads on the intranet so people start to see core compliance messages as they go about their daily business. we can separate some of the assets from the learning and start delivering them standalone. So the video that you saw in your primary training, which may have been 60 seconds long, maybe you see that again in 6 months' time, only now it's really a reminder or a booster shot or something to re-engage you with the content that you were looking at before. Then, of course, there's the whole performance support piece, whether those are technical, there could be an app to help you make decisions around gifts and entertainment, or it could be as simple as an infographic that shows you the 4 steps to reporting a red flag. And then thinking about updates and refreshes, and that's not just the scheduled updates and refreshes, it's having a plan to react when a new piece of information comes in that you have to push out to the organization, and making sure you do so in a branded way that feels as if it's coming from that single place. So yeah, I think as you move through the year, people get that sense that compliance isn't a one-off. It's part of the world that they live in, and it's a part of the world they live in that they actually enjoy engaging with. And I think we've got an example on the next slide. Very, very simple example of what that might look like. Yeah.
It is, and I think it's something that we keep coming back to is this idea of the compliance learning brand, something that sets the program apart within the organization, whether it's part of an email kit to start a training journey. Gabriel, could you just provide a bit more detail around what is a compliance training brand and what are the components that make it happen when a client comes to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, we definitely need to understand the culture, the overarching culture and tone of the organization, and then where does compliance want to sit? Do they want to be, more in a more serious seat, or they want to be in a more engaging, learner-focused or participant-focused seat? So that's first of all when it comes to developing a training brand. But then also, how is training delivered, and how are development activities delivered? So, what support if it's very one-to-one with management or team discussions? What support do they need? If it's very much online, what is that going to be scenario driven? Is it more content driven? And if so, why is it content driven? And how can we make that more engaging? But then also, going back to that point about regionalization that we talked about earlier. In this particular example, we were working with a company who has 12 different regions that we had to accommodate, and there was the core global learning plus this add-on set of workbooks and offline tools that people could carry forward to make sure that there's a consistent messaging to what they're going to experience when it comes to the regional content, the regionalized content that those regional owners would develop on their own and vet through an advisory board. That's a third leg of the stool, I would say, is that the brand is also about making sure that when it comes to governance, and clarity on how things get approved, what is priority, what does the calendar look like, that governance is also part of the brand, of the roles and responsibilities between the risk owners, L&D, and the compliance team are all very clear and aligned. I think that's kind of, again, that third leg of the stool when it comes to a brand.
Excellent. Well, thank you both, gents, for going through that. And Neil, maybe you could just move us on here. From what I've seen of the studies, they are very tactical. They provide a clear roadmap for improving the quality of compliance training, the overall communication and the governance that backs those programs, and they happen within 5 weeks. So I really appreciate you presenting those and making them clear and giving a strong sense of what happens during a study. Neil, could we pass over to you and see what questions have come in from the people listening in? As I appreciate it's quite a new area, so I'd be interested to see what questions have been thrown up.
Yeah, so there's an important one just in terms of how we handle the legal content analysis. So, whether we have a legal partner or if we have lawyers in-house, or just that legal content analysis piece and how exactly that works.
Matt, do you want to take that one for us?
Yeah, certainly. So the simple answer is we have a legal partner. We design and develop the content for our training. We work with an organization called Cordery, who are part of the LexisNexis group, and they review everything that we do and that we put out as a compliance training product. And that relationship is also available to leverage when we talk about these analysis pieces also. So our designers and our consultants have huge experience working in compliance, but they're not lawyers, so we do ask lawyers to take a look at everything we do before it goes to print. For our compliance products, just to make sure that everything's on point. And in fact, the same group, Cordery, review all of our product content once a year. and they make any updates that need to be made based on changes in regulatory legislation throughout the year. And they can alert us to anything that drops during the year that we need to jump on quickly. So we're already looking at our sort of late 2017 content and what we're going to need to do to adapt.
Fantastic. Neil, do you want to give us just two more and then we'll wrap it up?
Sure. So, I mean, Gabriel, you touched on the coordination of various different groups within the business and specifically the different content owners. And maybe you could shed a bit more light on what if there's a lack of cooperation between some of the groups, or, you know, some groups feel that things are working well and don't want to make changes, whereas others do, and just generally the dynamic around that.
Gabriel, you might be on mute.
Yeah,
you're in shock at the question.
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, it goes back to what we were discussing earlier in terms of step one being goal setting. You know, from a business goal, what is the operational and business goal when it comes to mandatory development and training efforts? So I think that having those players in the room every time we establish that goal and getting sign-off is step one, and then you use that as sort of your guiding principle going forward. And where there is misalignment, what we find is that we can still bring instructional design expertise and you know that manpower to the table to say, okay, the content is the content, but how can we approach that? You know, so obviously it meets its operational or business goal, but it still engages a learner. So how can we take content and make it more scenario driven, or provide content in feedback, or how can we unpack that content so that it's in smaller chunks, whether that's micro-learning, whether it's some of these quick hits through communication pieces that amplify the training content. So I think we have to be creative in where there may be that misalignment or guardianship of content and the weight of it. We have to make sure that we unpack it and approach it intelligently and build the business case for, number one, we have this operational and business goal here we're all pointing to, but then also from a learner engagement standpoint, this is a better path. And generally we find those conversations, that education process and those conversations can take some time, but we get there by being smart when it comes to instructional design and the learning approach.
Fantastic. Neil, maybe you could just choose a 60-second question, and whoever gets it will give us a rapid-fire response, and we'll wrap up to keep on time.
Yeah, we've got a short one, but an important one from Wendy, who's asking how we determine ROI. So essentially, I mean, how do we know that it works?
Definitely more than a 60-second one, but Matt, take a stab.
That's a huge one. Well, I'll answer this and I'll let Gabriel jump in as well. So there are areas of compliance that can be measured. Now, when we talk about ROI, some of that is in terms of saving, and when we look at these initiatives, it almost always involves reducing the overall burden of compliance training on the organization. And we do that by not just cutting content, but also by allowing people to test down, profiling, so that people only take the content that's absolutely relevant for them. So there's a saving there. And we find that those savings across the entire organization add up to quite a significant amount. But then I also think that whereas some areas of compliance are very, very difficult to measure, other areas are much easier to measure. So Gabriel mentioned the phishing earlier. You can quite often draw direct lines in terms of ROI between people's performance with IT security and also with physical security, the amount of devices that are lost or stolen through poor practice. So I think one of the key questions we ask at the beginning of the initiative is, what are you already measuring, and what costs are you already aware of that are associated with your compliance program in terms of its development and rollout, but also the impacts of non-compliance. Now, we're not talking about the huge fines. I mean, I think I don't think you can include those in the ROI. They're too difficult to identify, but we are talking about the everyday practice. We ask what you're already aware of, and those become our targets. So if it's costing you X, we want to bring it down to Y. And if you're seeing an opportunity to improve an area that you know is costing the business money, then we can target our programs towards that. Gabriel, do you want to add anything in?
Yeah, in terms of these specific studies, I think we know that these studies are working, and our time is providing value because many of our suggestions and recommendations are being implemented, whether we partner or they do them internally. So in terms of this solution, I think there's our clients are seeing value. In terms of ROI more broadly, the other thing I would add, Matt, is that we're also seeing ROI in terms of the SME's effort to stand up and deliver content annually. If you create this sort of governing body, if you have these templates in place, if you have smart vetted content that is targeted to particular roles in the organization, then those SMEs and content owners find the lift they have annually to produce and release content lowered. So there's an internal ROI, outside of fines or lost property, that sort of thing.
Fantastic. Well, listen, let's wrap up there. Matt and Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us. And also everybody on the phone, compliance training, it's a heavy subject. Getting it right is complex, but I think you've done a great job of talking about what we can achieve in 5 weeks. Just as some follow-up, we'll be sending out a copy of the presentation, and then I think it's in the 2nd and 3rd week of January, myself and Gabriel have some time mapped out for any firms that want to talk one-on-one about what a study like this would look like in their organization, what goals would be applicable. All that information will be coming in an email that Neil will be sending on. But again, thank you everybody for participating, both on the phone and who listened. We love doing these. Any feedback you have or suggestions for future topics are also welcome. If we don't speak with any of you before the holidays, have a super holiday season too. Thank you.